Okay, we are beginning chapter 51. There's only 3 chapters left in the Sefer Shalbeinanim, but don't worry, there's still more Torah to learn. It will not have brought us to the end of the internet. And these 3 chapters are going to be one sort of theme, which will focus on the presence, the idea that Hashem's presence is particularly in the Holy of Holies, and what that really means as far as our understanding that God's presence could be more in one place than in another place, or more in one circumstance. Of course, a fundamental truth is that there is only God and God is unlimited. So what do we mean when we describe God's presence as being more in a certain physical location? And the whole idea that God confines himself to linear time and spatial quantification and so on. We are also going to be revisiting a quote from chapter 35, which I included in the email, if people had a chance to look it over, and it is based on a statement of the Yanuka. Now, the word Yanuka means the youngster, and it's a reference to a group of very young scholars. And this is the one who was known as the youngster. The Yanuka was the son of Reb Hamnuna Saba, one of our great sages. So it wasn't his name, it was more like a title. And he elaborated on a quote from the book of Koheles, Ecclesiastes, written by Shlomo HaMelech, that says something that on the surface seems to be so obvious as to be almost meaningless. He says in Koheles chapter 2, HaChacham Einav Beroshai, which translates as the wise person, his eyes are in his head. Which prompts the obvious question from the Zohar. I mean, everybody's eyes are in their head. What is the meaning? It is certainly not an anatomical description. For this, we don't need Shlomo HaMelech to tell us that our eyes are in our head. So the Zohar explains that this is what the pasuk means, that a person should never go more than 4 steps with an uncovered head. Why? Because the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests on our head. That is, every wise person, because the quote is the wise person, his eyes are in his head. His eyes, that is, like we even say in English, his focus, where he's looking, is on that which is above him, on his head. And what is on his head is his eyes. What is on his head is the Shekhinah. And what is it that he is looking at? How can he preserve, how can he maintain the divine presence to be continuously above him? And the answer to that is by feeding it the fuel that keeps it together, just like a lamp is a combination of oil, a wick, and a flame. And what prevents the flame from consuming the wick, or the wick from smothering the flame, is the oil. The oil calibrates the process of the flames burning so that it doesn't consume the wick, because if you just dropped a piece of cotton into a flame, it would be burned up in a moment. Or if you had a big giant clump of wool and you threw it over a small spark, it would extinguish it. So what is it that calibrates that the flame should continuously burn? Is the spark, the flame, the wick, and the oil. And the oil is what prolongs the flame. And this is what the verse means in Psalms when it says, oil on his head you should not diminish. Meaning, what is it that keeps the oil on the head? What is it that keeps the flame burning? This is through the action of mitzvahs. This is the Yanuka's interpretation of the idea that the wise man, his eyes are on his head. That is, he is constantly focused. How can I maintain that the flame should stay upon my head and not either consume me or abandon me, just burn out? And the answer is through the mitzvah actions. Now, this is a concept that we are eminently familiar with. It's baked into our social, cultural idea that it's all about doing a mitzvah, and every individual mitzvah maintains the godly presence upon the individual and by extension upon the environment in which they are in. And much of what we are going to be talking about is how, in fact, is it possible that a human being with human activity, that is the mitzvahs, is able to evoke this characteristic that the divine presence should dwell in this world. Now, you people think everything is Hashgacha Pratis, the divine providence. It's the parshas that we're talking about now, the building of the Mishkan, and particularly the parsha that we begin today, Kisisa, where we speak about one of the obligations is to anoint. That is, they took oil and they anointed the different utensils in the Mishkan, and the Kohen, and of course the Kohen Gadol and kings. What is the message of putting oil on the person's head, especially since it's not something that we are accustomed to, so it seems odd. So herein lies this further explanation, that the oil is the reminder of our capacity to maintain and sustain the presence of Hashem in our physical body through our physical actions, namely, precisely, specifically, the mitzvah behaviors. That when we do the mitzvahs, we bring we maintain, we hold on to the divine presence, that it should hover above us. It should be maintained above us. Now, another Hashgacha Pratis. So this week is Purim Katan, and in a shameless cross-promotional plug for the Wednesday night Maimer class. So we're learning the Maimer from our Rebbe that's based on a Maimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe that was said in 1927 on Purim Katan, based on the parsha that we just read yesterday, Data Tetzava. And there's a sort of backstory that this was 1927. It was communist Russia. We know that later that spring, the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested, and that's the miracle of the 12th of Tammuz when the Frierdiker Rebbe was released after he'd been sentenced to death and then to harsh labor and so on. Now, during that Farbrengen, the Hasidim were getting a little nervous because the Farbrengens were all the things the communists hated. It was assembly, which all assembly meant revolution. They were talking Torah. They didn't like that. They were giving tzedakah. They didn't like that. I mean, there was all the things that the communists hated were in Farbrengen. And here the Frierdiker Rebbe was making this Farbrengen. And these Hasidim are, and it's loud, and they're singing and so on. So they, but on the other hand, it's the Rebbe, so you're not going to say anything. But it's on the other hand, the KGB don't play nice. So somebody said to the Rebbe, the people downstairs are going to call the police. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, do not be so concerned with what is beneath you, be more concerned with what is above you. So this message about the wise man, his eyes are in his head, again, is not meant to be an anatomical description of our humanity. For this, we don't need Kohelet, Shlomo HaMelech, to teach us this. It's rather the idea that it's associated with this idea that the distinctive quality of a human being is not just opposable thumbs. It is the ability to bend their head to look up and see the infinite expanse, in contrast to an animal who's on all fours, and the head and the legs and the lower parts of the body are all on the same plane. There is no superiority to the head. They only see what is immediately in front of them, and they don't have the capacity to see the infinite expanse that is above them. So this message here that we're going to elaborate on, we're going to revisit from chapter 35 that we just read, is not only about the capacity to keep godliness above us through doing the mitzvahs, and thus not to be overwhelmed by God as we were at Matan Torah, where there was so much godliness that we couldn't deal with it, or to ignore the godliness because it's not something that I can touch and feel, like the animal only sees what's right in front of his face. This ability, which we're going to explore for a human being to sustain and maintain the divine presence in this physical world through human behavior, mitzvahs, is through his awareness that there's something greater than myself. Okay, so this is our approach. So the chapter is going to deal with a quote, another introductory quote from the book of Job. In the book of Job, he has a quote that says, "From my flesh I see God." In Hebrew, "Mibsari echsa elaka." From my flesh I see God. This is a commonly quoted pasuk that is understood to mean that as we understand our human functionality, it becomes a looking glass into how Hashem interacts with the world. We know this even in the physical world. Much of engineering models the human body. We talk about arteries on a highway system. We talk about a human metaphor analogy for all forms of construction and so forth. Well, another opportunity that we have is by understanding the dynamic of the body and the soul, we can also understand the dynamic of God and the world. So this is going to be pursued, that just as the soul fills the body, and yet it is in the brain that it is dispatched to the rest of the body, and the person's brain is the center, the control center of their identity, similar to a relationship that we have with the infinity of Hashem filling this world, and yet there being these nerve centers within creation. We'll talk about the indivisibility of the neshama. The neshama in my hand is no different than the neshama in my head. The God in Yerushalayim is not different than the God in the grocery store, in the most ordinary of circumstances. And how it is dispatched from the brain, from the center of the infinity of Hashem to the entirety. And we'll talk about these in some greater detail. And then in the second half, we're going to revisit this quote from the Yanuka and further elaborate upon that. Okay, so with all of this introduction, we begin this final theme of these 3 chapters that conclude the Sefer Shalbeinu. Perek Nunal, Vehine, the Tosfos Bir Lashon HaYanuka Diliel. Pardon me. So now that we return, we can now return to the quote from the Yanuka from back in chapter 35. Now? Why couldn't this have been elaborated upon back in chapter 35? Why does the Alter Rebbe leave it for another 15 chapters until we revisit it? If chapter 35 is where we discuss the teaching of the Yanuka, so let's just fully elaborate on it. So we explain that what we have evoked from the previous couple of chapters, where we've talked about the capacity to find Hashem through our human interaction. And specifically, as we talked about in the previous chapter, that we have a distinctive degree of love of Hashem that is contained within the Gevura, that is the non-intuitively aligned side of our relationship with Hashem. That is, we tend to think of godliness and the love of Hashem being associated with Ava. But now we understand that it is associated also in a more profound manner based on what we talked about in chapter 50, from the left side of the heart. And we talked about precision. Remember, we used the analogy of music, which communicates something that's amorphous, but it is based on something that is extraordinarily rigid. I don't play music, but a person doesn't just bang away at the piano. They have to be very disciplined in order to create something that is associated with beauty, and it is predicated on something that is evoked through rigid discipline, through extraordinarily precise methods of moving the fingers and so forth, and the keys and system and rhythm and so on and so forth. So now that we understand the distinctive quality of Gevura, and the Gevura, again, sometimes it gets a bum rap and it's thought of as being like mean or harsh. It's not that. It's like being orderly. It's square pegs in the square holes. It fits together with a process and systems and so forth. That distinctive feature that we have elaborated on, that we have discovered, that we have focused on in chapter 50, that it evokes, not only it's also necessary, that a person also has to be rigidly disciplined and can't just go off emotionally and intuitively, as much as we'd love to dance and sing and jump up and down, which we're in favor of. It's that the Gevura is a method for evoking a love of Hashem. So this is sort of the distinctive chiddush, innovative point from chapter 50 that now allows us to revisit this quote about the wise man, his eyes are in his head, and about the oil and so forth that we mentioned back in chapter 35, which at that time we weren't ready, quote unquote, to fully develop and explain. And again, the idea that we have introduced here is that Gevura, orderliness, can evoke an infinite quality. Meaning the tendency is to assume that when we act in an unbridled manner, so we have unbridled consequence. And there's a certain, I'll call it romanticism associated with that, which is not untrue. And that's why, for example, coming up on Purim, we talk about our ability to override the distinction between blessed is Mordechai and wicked is Haman. And there's a definitive part. We talk about Purim is a level that's higher than Yom Kippur. And we talk about Simchas Torah when we dance with the Torah in contrast to when we study the Torah. That we have unbridled celebration and we evoke unbridled godliness. And then we talk about the orderliness, that tefillin have to be perfectly square and matzahs have to be made under 18 minutes and the lulav has to be straight and the esrog has to have no blemishes, et cetera, et cetera. And in that context and in those circumstances, we talk about the rigidity. And the common understanding, and it's not wrong, but it's limited, is that one is the love of Hashem and the other is the reverence of Hashem. And in any relationship, especially a hierarchical relationship like a parent and a child, there needs to be both love and there needs to be reverence. And we don't get chummy with the parent. There has to be a relationship between the teacher and the student. There can be warmth and closeness, and there also has to be distance and obedience. So in chapter 50 that we explained that there can be a superior level of love that is born of orderly rigidity. That is not only that we also need that like the two wings on the bird, that the Gevura can evoke the quality of ahava, of love, of unbridled. This is what now empowers us to see the statement of the Yanuka about the wise man keeping his eyes on his head and sustaining the divine presence through the mitzvahs in a whole different perspective. Heretofore, we understood, right, as long as we will be acting in a way that is obedient, so then Hashem will gift us his presence. Now we understand it at an additional level, that through the acts of mitzvahs, we are not only being compliant and thus deserving of this divine presence, it is that we are being, we are evoking a love of Hashem as expressed through this orderliness. That, again, like the music analogy. So now we are ready to go back and see this idea. We first are going to explain lahovin ktsas, at least to understand it a little bit. Now, we recognize that throughout the 50 chapters of Tanya that we've learned, the Alter Rebbe has sometimes used the phrase lahovin be'er heitiv, which translates as to understand something very well. Now, of course, we want to understand everything very well. And we know how precise every word in the Tanya is, how the Alter Rebbe, I'll use this word, agonized over every line until he was able to choose even one letter. And we mentioned it when we came upon it, when the Alter Rebbe rewrote the whole Tanya in his head to see whether he should add one letter of Vav in one word. So what does the Alter Rebbe mean here, which seems to be almost a disclaimer that our objective here is to understand it a little bit. We have talked a lot about lahavin be'er heitiv, to understand something extraordinarily thoroughly, and by which we interpreted it to mean not only that we can academically recite it, it's also that we can personalize and integrate it into our character. And here the Alter Rebbe is describing it, or describing our objective as lahavin ksas, to understand it only a little bit. So, of course, well, I want to understand it a lot of it. Why do we only want to understand a little bit? What kind of aspiration is that? That seems kind of disappointing. So we now can explain that what we are referencing to here is the limitation of understanding. And this is going to touch upon where we're headed. Now, we know, and sort of to back up, and this won't surprise anybody, that on the one hand, the greatest gift that we have is our capacity for intellect. And that allows us to get out over ourselves, to go beyond our own sensory experiences of I'm here, I want, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm grumpy, this is what I want, and to recognize that there's something more than myself. And this is what every parent tries to teach a child. And then an infant is innately only self-aware. They're tired, they cry, they're hungry, they cry, they want something, they cry. And then a parent hopes to educate the child and say, you know what, there are other people here, there's other things here besides just the impulsivity of yourself. And if you have ever experienced, and unfortunately I imagine everybody has, somebody whose parents didn't teach them that, and they're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, and they're still just as self-absorbed as they were when they were an infant, you recognize the absence of chachma. It doesn't mean they're not geniuses, and doesn't mean that they cannot recite pages and pages of Talmud and achieve great social and well, not social, but financial success, economic success. It doesn't mean they're not smart, but they have no awareness of anything other than themselves. So this is our greatest gift. On the other hand, or concurrently, simultaneously, it's not oppositional, there's something higher than intellect. And this is a little bit where we're headed down the path when we keep our eyes in our head to see above our head. Now, obviously, this is for men, but one of the messages of wearing a yarmulke, which the word yarmulke is a combination of two phrases, yira malka, the reverence of the king, is to remember that there's something greater than intellect, not only greater than my personal intellect, but greater than intellect at all. Now, we live in a society where something that you can't understand, we call it, so that's stupid. And stupid means it's immoral. It's inappropriate. But as we know, it's in the Basta Lagani Maimer, everyone recognizes, there is holy stupidity. I mean, holy craziness. And we know this even in our social awareness, because great artists or even people with great business vision come up with ideas. People say, that's crazy. You'll never be able to do that. And then they do it. Now, of course, for every one that gets done, there are 1,000 that are stupid. So this isn't licensed to just go act out on total impulsivity and to override intellect. Again, this is chapter 51. Now that we have established the significance of Chachma, of our capacity to open up our intellect, we have to also recognize or remind ourselves of the significance of overriding our intellect and not being imprisoned by our intellect. So here we go. So that's why, I'm sorry, it's only somewhat an understanding of somewhat, because if we're going to make it our absolute goal only to have full understanding, A, we'll never get there, and B, we can become handicapped by it. And this is a little bit what I think the Alter Rebbe is alluding to with this, I'm going to call it disclaimer, that our objective is only to understand it a little bit. Why don't we understand it a lot of it? Because again, understanding it a little bit is our opportunity. Inyan hashras hashchina, the idea of the dwelling of the Shechina, shahaisa shira beis kodesh hakadashim, that dwelt in the Holy of Holies. V'chein kol makom hashras hashchina, and anytime we say that the Shechina rests there, ma'anyane, what does that mean? That the Shechina rests there. Haloi molek kol aretz k'voidai, v'les asa panomine, is not the whole world filled with the glory of God, and there is no space that is empty of him? So here are a couple of important points. And again, I know my tendency is to wander a little, so feel free to pull out the shepherd's crook and say, could you stick to the text? But we're trying to, that was our commitment for this time around, right? To be more precise in each word. So here, excuse me, here, the Alter Rebbe really starts to take us down a path, so it's important. And again, it's nice that it's the parshas that we're learning now. 2 weeks ago, we read the quote, the bumper sticker of all of Torah, make for me a sanctuary and I'll dwell amongst them, which is our whole mission statement. So the Alter Rebbe says, our objective is to understand this idea of the divine presence, the resting of the divine presence. So it's a couple of points. The word Shechina, which we translated probably as divine presence or something like that, it's the word for a resident. A neighborhood is a shchuna, the place where people live. A shachen is your neighbor. So the Mishkan is the neighbor. It is where the divine presence is. Now we know, because the Alter Rebbe has taught us, and it's baked into our whole cultural identity, that the goal of all of this stuff is Dira B'Tachtenim, dwelling place in the least evidently godly worlds. What does God want? Why does He create the world? Why are we here, and what do we hope to achieve? Make me a place that I can dwell amongst you. So there's a certain curiosity that is this beautiful sort of nuance here. But I don't know what the word is. It's like it's almost it's like two things that are opposites. I can't think of the word. Whatever it is. Anyway, on the one hand, when we talk about the word Shechina, we really are talking about a very, I'll use this word, shallow level of godliness. It's like your neighbor. What do you know about your neighbor? Well, you know the car they park in the driveway. You know whether they mow their lawn. You know what they look like. You know their name, but you don't really know the depth of their identity. It doesn't mean you're welcomed into the privacy of their lives. So you are aware of them at a surface level. So on the one hand, when we use the word Shechina, we mean that it's just a surface level. In contrast, for example, to the levels of Hashem that we describe with the Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, which is the most intensely private, personal levels of godliness that are contained within the very essence of God's existence, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, as you'll recognize, that in the morning davening, and in other communities, it's not our minhag, but in other communities, they do this before numerous mitzvah actions, but we do it once a day as a sort of tone setter. So if you look in your siddur, just before the Baruch Sha'amar, it's like page 30 or something like that, there's a little line, and it's a declaration, and it reads, I'll just say it first it's actually Aramaic, it will say, L'shem yichud kol shabrichu v'shchinte b'yud ke b'vav ke. That is, the goal is, what is our mission? What are we here to do? To unify the Shem Havaya, this level, this incredibly personal, intense level with God, with the Shchinte, with His divine presence as it is here in this world. So that when we encounter God, we are encountering Him not just at the car parked in the driveway, etc. We are aware of the most personalized level of godliness. So when we talk about the presence of the Shechina, the Hashras HaShechina, and there are quotes that tell us this at other times, we'd say that wherever 10 people gather, the Shechina is present. The Shechina rests over a person at the end of their life, the person on their deathbed. You recognize that from when Yosef goes to visit Yaakov when he's on his deathbed. And numerous other descriptions about where the Shechina rests, which of course raises the essential question. God is everywhere. And as the Alter Rebbe gives us two quotes in it, it says, what is its goal? Is it not that, and here's two quotes, the whole world is filled with His glory, and there is no place that is devoid of Him. So the question is, why does the Alter Rebbe have to give us two quotes? He doesn't need to show off. We're pretty impressed with him. Why does he have to tell us two quotes? Just one of those quotes would be sufficient. So herein lies two different aspects. On the one hand, Alter Rebbe quotes that the world is filled with His glory, but His glory is only His glory. It's like the world is filled with you'll excuse the analogy, as we say, lahavdil, with the impact of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Nobody's life is untouched by it. But it doesn't mean that I'm buddies with the person. It doesn't mean I know him. Yes, I'm affected by him and by Thomas Edison and, et cetera, et cetera. Their glory, that is their accomplishment, affects all of our lives. We cannot escape it. We are all touched by, there is no place that is not touched by, again, the computer or whatever it may be. But it's only Kvoida. So maybe the Alter Rebbe, if he just left us with that quote, we would say, right, that's where God's glory is. Now, in the headquarters, just to follow my analogy, another step of Apple, there you really see it predominantly. When I'm using it, I don't always think about, even when I'm eating my lunch, that also is only the product, because in order for them to manufacture it and so on. So there are times that it's more obvious and times that it's less obvious. So right now we're all using the computer, so it is clearly obvious that our lives are affected by it. And when we're walking down the street, our lives are also being affected by it because the big brother is watching us. But beyond that, it's not to our conscious awareness. So if we only went with this first quote, the whole of the earth is filled with his glory, so then we'd understand. And it's not untrue. There are times when we're more conscious of it, times when we're less conscious of it, just like a parent and a child. There are times when the child is more conscious of the parent's influence on them, and times when they're less cognizant of it. And of course, the parent is constantly, even when, though, of course, when the child is an infant, the parent is more cognizant, but there's no time when the parent says, what's my kids' names again? Right? I mean, it is always in the fore of their mind, even when their children are adults, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe adds the second quote, there is no place that is devoid of him, of his very being. So if that's the case, so let's go back to, so what do we need the first one for? If you have two quotes, that means each one adds something. If the second one addresses the deficiency of the first one, so just have the second one and not have the first one. Because while it is absolute, and this is our point, that God is everywhere, but maybe I don't notice it at all. I mean, think about all the influences in our lives that we never notice, not that fluctuates in its notice, where we may never notice. So even if we never notice it and it's there, yes, thankfully it's like air. If you forget the necessity of oxygen, you go underwater and you remember. But since we can never get outside of our relationship with Hashem, there's no place to go for contrast. So it could be that we would never notice it at all. And that's why we have to go back to Mala Aretz Kvoidai. The world is filled with his glory, and his glory meaning his impact or his tangible impact. Let's put it that way. The word Kvoidai, which is commonly translated as glory, like the word kavod, like honor your parents, the same word. What it truly means, its literal meaning is weighty. Like we would say in English, that's really heavy. That's a heavy idea, as opposed to something that's light, that's easily dismissed. So just to take that one step further for a moment, when we're told to honor our parents, kaved, the same word, what it means is to treat them with stature and not to dismiss them. Because the opposite of kaved is to dismiss it, is to ignore it. So when we say the world is filled with his glory, what it most literally means is the world is filled with the impact, maybe that's the word that we would use, of Hashem. And sometimes we are cognizant of it, like my analogy, and sometimes we're less so. So based on this idea, and again, this is a core point that really until chapter 51, we may not have been able to seriously address. You may recall quickly the story about Hashem is here, Hashem is there, that I told many times. So the principal, who's a God-fearing man, says, what do you mean? God is not up, down, right, left, and all around. God is in heaven. And this is a representation of a perspective, a Torah, God-fearing people perspective, that God is not here, there, and everywhere, up, down, right, left, and all around. God is in heaven. And the contrast, again, he supported it by saying, the verse before the giving of the Ten Commandments says God came down to Mount Sinai, which would be the standard interpretation. But Onkelos translates that God revealed himself at Har Sinai. And this is, again, we call it the yeshiva word is a shita. It's a philosophy that exists amongst God-fearing Torah people, that God is in heaven. God is not here. And this argument that we make, there is no place that is devoid of him, means it literally. So since God is in the grocery store and God is in the most horrific of circumstances, what does it mean when we say that God's presence is in the Holy of Holies? God's presence is everywhere. What is the difference? What is the difference? It's like, I think I must have told this story before. There was this man, I'll make it brief, and he was sort of looking for a community. So he's traveling around in the Shtetlach in Europe, and he's trying to see where he fits in. So he goes to this one community, and it's Pesach. So they're finished davening. They're going to go to the Seder. And of course, he's invited. And they say, okay, let's go have dinner. And he was like, repulsed. Dinner? That's how you refer to the Seder? Let's go have dinner. He didn't like it. So he left. He kept traveling out. He was not happy. He came. He says, I'm going to give him another chance. He came for Yom Kippur. So they're going to go to call Nidre. And they say, okay, everybody, Ma'ariv. And he didn't like Ma'ariv. This is called Nidre. This is Yom Kippur. So this time he couldn't take it. He says to him, how could you just say Ma'ariv? He said, no, you don't understand. Every night we daven like this. But I mean, this is a conceptual idea. We just had a couple of examples. A couple of weeks ago, we had the reading of the Ten Commandments in Parshas Yisro. And the week before that, we have the reading of the splitting of the sea in Parshas Beshalach. Now, it is our custom, and a very common custom, that we stand up at those Torah readings. You know, we pause, we indicate it, everybody stands up. There is such a position in Torah, and that is amongst Torah people, you know, God-fearing people. What do you mean? Why are you standing up for the Ten Commandments? You decided that's more important? Every word of Torah is precious. We know this. If any letter in the Torah is deformed, even if the letter is a description of one of Esav's offspring, the whole Torah has to be put on hold. So who are you to determine that this one you stand up for and this one is less important? Every word of Torah is absolutely indispensable. Every reading of Torah is indispensable. So they take a position, no, we're not making an exception. I mean, you could see the logic in it. Now, we don't do that. We do stand up for it. And we do think that Yerushalayim is different than my neighborhood. And we do think the Kaisel is, but this is the Alter Rebbe's question. Why? And I guess maybe we could argue if we were truly tzaddikim, we wouldn't see any difference between Yom Kippur and Tuesday, between dinner and the Seder, between the offspring of Esav and the reading of the Ten Commandments. They're all absolutely integral. So what, in fact, does this mean? And it's not just, well, we're not so super sensitive to it, and therefore we think it's different. But this becomes the question. What makes something better in that sense of it, more godly? Everything is godly. There's nothing else besides Hashem. The point being, you see, the Alter Rebbe has both a period and then that word ach. So he really hammers it home. So he says, like the verse says, and this is the quote that we referenced earlier, it comes from the book of Job. From my flesh, I see God. Now, we know the story of Job, the man who suffered unimaginable sufferings and so forth, and still kept his resilience. So the context of the pasuk actually has nothing to do with the way we are using it here. We're sort of borrowing it. And the message that we are attempting to convey here is that by understanding my human functionality, it becomes an entryway into understanding the divine functionality. The way in which my life force, my godly existence, sustains my humanity and the union between them becomes an opportunity to have a looking glass into understanding the way that Hashem interacts with the world. So here we go. That is, that just as the entirety of my humanity is filled with my neshama, it fills every aspect of it, from the nose to the toes, as we say. Bafel Pike, nevertheless, Iker Mishkan of Ashrasa, the primary identifiable characteristic of me is in the brain. That's what makes me more me than anything else. Now, I'm not here to discuss the biology, etc., but to tell a mildly humorous anecdote. So one time, we're visiting with people, and the parent is playing with the child. So they're tickling the child. So the child says, stop doing it. The parent says, I didn't do it. You know, and they're sort of playing this back and forth hide and seek type of game. So then the child catches the parent. He says, you did it. This is your hand. He says, how do you know that's my hand? So the child says, what do you mean? It's attached to you. So the question becomes, so what's you? Meaning, if the hand is you because it's attached to you, so what's you? So I don't think the child was all that interested in some great philosophical concept, but this becomes our question. What is the you? What is it that is distinctive, or that's not even the right word? What is it that is the primary presence of our identity through which it is then dispatched to the rest of our being. Now, again, we're not here to discuss the medical, biological, anatomical characteristic of it. We're just here to borrow that as an analogy. And we've talked about this way back in the earlier parts of Tanya, the sort of dynamic between the heart dispatching the blood to the body and the brain dispatching the nerves to the body. I give us all a bracha. We should never know what happens if one of them doesn't work. Thank God they work, and it should work every day. The question becomes, and we have this in a halachic sense, and again, I don't want to go down this path because it's way above my capacity and it's going to distract us, but what in fact is the determinant of life? Is it the brain that sends the nervous system its signals, or is it the heart that sends the blood? So again, we're not here to discuss the medical, but conceptually, what we have talked about is that the heart dispatches the blood, and that biological function is the seat of our humanity. The brain that dispatches the nerves and this whatever that whole system is the centerpiece that dispatches the spiritual side, the characteristic side. That is why we have biological commonality with animals. You know, they have a respiratory system and I don't remember, I didn't pay attention to biology in high school. They have the blood and so on. And even though, and again, I'm not here for brain waves, but the brain, the mind, which is aligned with the brain, is where the human being becomes distinguished from the animal, which is most predominantly expressed through speech. And yes, it's true that animals can signal each other, but animals don't have the capacity for thought beyond themselves. They can be trained. A person can be trained too. If you train the child that if you ask him what's 2 times 3 and he says 6, he gets a sticker. You have trained him. He may not even understand what he's saying. He just knows that if he says it, he gets a reward. So he says it. Again, so when we're using the word maya, which we a little bit use it interchangeably with the word mind and brain, because we're not talking so much here about the biological organ as much as we're talking about the conceptual idea, is where the profundity of the person's identity is to be found. Now, is that person's identity in their fingertips? Yes. And you recall from way back in the very beginning of Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe addressed the question that aren't there certain neshamas that are, quote, more godly than others? And we sort of gave a little bit of a dual answer. On the one hand, we said that just like the body of the child is the product of the same act of conception, whether we're talking about the brain, the heart, the liver, the sophisticated organs, or the fingernails, the least sophisticated organs, they are all that product. And then concurrently, we said that they are nourished by the brain. That's what sends that sustainability to even the fingernails and the hair and the least sensitized aspects of our identity. And, you know, modern DNA gives us another tool to understand this idea. And again, we don't want to be overly fixated on the anatomical character. More, we want to be talking about the conceptual spiritual idea. So here we go. And from the brain, it dispatches this capacity to all of the limbs. And each one of the limbs receive, and this is really a significant point, of course, everything is, they receive the character of the life force that matches them, lefi mizgoy, according to its shape, mitchunasai, and its capacity. Ha'ayin lirois va'ozen l'shmaya va'pel ledaber va'alaglayim lahaloch kinur b'chush. That is, the eye receives the capacity for sight, the ears receive the capacity for hearing, the mouth for speech, the feet for movement, as we can see. Now, this is evident to us because the brain senses all the different aspects of the functionality of the body. That's why if the finger hurts, the brain recognizes that it's the finger that hurts. Now, again, I don't want to be overly fixated on the anatomical and so on, But we do know, even from our own just sort of social awareness, that there are reports of people who have brain injuries and they don't recognize even what's going on in their own body. And that's why they become a danger to themselves, because their brain doesn't register that their hand is in pain. And therefore they don't pull away from a sharp instrument or from a fire or whatever it may be, because they've disturbed this natural functionality. We have an example in Torah. After the giving of the Ten Commandments, we read a few weeks ago in Parshas Yisro, the Torah says, and they saw the thunder and heard the light. They saw the thunder and heard the lightning. So, of course, you don't see thunder and you don't hear lightning. You hear thunder and you see lightning. So it will not surprise you that there are two opinions. One opinion is, no. They saw the lightning, they heard the thunder, and you have to read it this way. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, that's exactly what happened. There was such a disruption of the natural order that they physically experienced things differently. They saw sound and they heard sights. And again, you could Google it around, and if it's on YouTube, it must be true that there are people who have this type of experience where they experience color through sound and sound through vision, et cetera, et cetera. That's not our point, except to illustrate this idea that contained within the brain is the essential identity of the person, which is then dispatched, God willing, in a healthy manner to each of the parts of the body that is sensitized to its individuality, to its particular skill. The eye sees, the ear hears, the feet move, the mouth speaks, etc. Now, what's the nimshal? What's on the other side? Is going to be the same idea, that there are nerve centers, so to speak, of godliness, the holy of holies, tzaddikim, and so on. And then it is dispatched through them to each of us, each person according to his ability. Now, we have a tendency, and it's not a bad thing, to a little bit of impatience. We want more godliness and we want it now. And that's not a bad thing innately, except that sometimes it overwhelms us, like it was at Sinai, where Hashem spoke to us and it was so much, it knocked us backwards. So, the Alter Rebbe continues. V'hinei ein shinoi kabbalas hakoiches v'achayis shebe'evir haguf ben hashama metzar atzmo mehusa sheyu mehusa v'atzmusa mischalek l'remach chalakim shonim mislap sh'remach b'koimis k'fitzir chalkim b'koimai evri haguf. Now, the divine capacity, in its essence, is contour. It becomes shaped to match sight to the eye and so on, but it does not change the essential fabric of its identity. I mean, we do this intuitively. An analogy, a teacher in a classroom, a parent with children, anyone who's in any kind of multiple series of relationships. Each one, which we have to compress our identity to match the character of the person to whom we are speaking. So if you teach first grade and you teach 10th grade, you don't teach them the same way. This child needs a different type of guidance. This one needs more creativity. This one needs more freedom. Each person, this is how we are. We deal with them differently. But the essence of our identity, hopefully, I mean, again, this is where we have to be cautious about being sensitive to the recipient and being phony. The two are not the same, although it feels that way. Or it could feel that way, that we're somehow being disingenuous by teaching the first grader differently than we teach the 10th grader. Because the essence comes through, and it has to come through in a manner in which it is manifest. An example of this is, again, one that we're all familiar with. It's the whole Tishrei process, where you have the most solemn of days and the most celebratory of days. How could this be the same person who pulled their talis over their head and wept for 25 hours on Yom Kippur, and now they're jumping up and down and jumping the bima on Simchas Torah? How does that go together? How could this be the same person? It can't even imagine that these are the same people. So this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. There is no real change in the essence of it. There's only a change in the form. And that form is contoured to what is necessary. So it is still the essence. And again, we know here, so to speak, that from the DNA. Although we discard our hair and fingernails, they contain the very essence of our identity. So it's both. It is the eye or the ear or the mouth or the feet quality or character of human identity, and it is the infinity of my very existence at the same time. The two are absolutely rolled into one. There's one little curious note that when the Alter Rebbe lists out the body parts, eyes, ears, mouth, he omits the nose. So there's, again, everything is precise and our tendency to overanalyze everything. Why does he omit the nose? I mean, if you're going to cover them all. So one distinctive quality of the nose is that's where life is breathed into. You remember that when God creates Adam, it says he blew the breath of life into his nostrils. So in a certain sense, and it's kind of a curiosity without getting too far afield, we talked about this a little bit on Shabbos when we spoke about the incense, that the nose, the capacity to smell, I mean, it certainly adds a lot of joy to life, but God forbid, if a person lost their capacity for smell, it's not as debilitating like as if they lost their capacity to see or to hear or to speak. So on the one hand, it's not that super sensitive. On the other hand, the whole essence of the person's life is breathed into his nose. And this is a suggestion as to why possibly the Alter Rebbe omitted the nose, because it isn't so distinct. It is sort of the essence of it. It's not just one characteristic. And we talk about this. There's a whole science associated with smell and the memory of that it evokes. And we mentioned this on Shabbos, the idea of the incense that burns, that overrides even the subtlest of imperfections. Lahavdil, Starbucks pumps in a certain aroma that brings a certain soothing quality that makes you spend $30 for coffee, etc. There's this whole mode setting that is associated with aroma. On the one hand, you could live without it. I mean, again, it wouldn't be, God forbid, not that we're wishing it away, but it's not so debilitating like, God forbid, a person goes blind. Concurrently, it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of the essence of the person's identity as God blew the breath of life into it. So again, the point being that the essence of the neshama is essentially to be found, not just essentially, it is literally to be found in every aspect of our existence. And then it has to be contoured so that it's particularized, and that particularization is dictated by the recipient, by the keli, as we call it, the utensil that shapes it. So what we wind up with is the very essence and fabric and identity embedded in that particularism. And hopefully you can kind of see where this is headed, that this is how it is with every mitzvah. It is the very essence and being and fabric of the infinity of Hashem compressed into this particular action. And sometimes maybe a person feels a frustration. I put up the mezuzah, I ate the matzah, I shook the lulav. Where's the infinity of Hashem? And this is what we're telling you. It is compressed into that identity. So of course, Hashem is not confined by human constriction. That Hashem is, of course, completely stripped down. That's this phrase, pashut umufshat, completely stripped down in a positive sense of any form of the material, of any categorization, of any spatial, or even of any midah. That's why we have to be so careful. We can't say God is kind, because that's limiting God. Maybe he's capricious. We say that God associates with the spheres, but we cannot say that God is locked into the spheres. And therefore, he's not locked into any particular place because of his very essence and identity. We can't say based on the essence that it's in the head more than in the feet. Because he is not compressed or categorizable by any specificity. The 613 abilities and capacities are the mechanism to reveal what was innately there. So when we're doing a mitzvah, we are both accessing that particularism. So Pesach, we're going to remember that we went out of Mitzrayim. And on the Purim, we're going to remember that God saved us. And on Sukkot, we're going to remember that God protects us. And on Rosh Hashanah, we're going to remember that God is our king. And when we put up the mezuzah, we remember that God protects us. And when we light candles, we remember that God gave us the Shabbos. And this becomes an access point to uncover the essence of it. An illustration of this idea that we're familiar with is every mitzvah bracha, that is the bracha we say before we do a mitzvah, begins with the same standard text. Asher Kedishanu, he sanctified us with his mitzvahs. That's true of everything. And now we gave us a specific mitzvah. This is one of the many reasons why we have to be so cautious about grading mitzvahs. That's a big one. That's not such a big one. Because every mitzvah is an access point to uncover the essence of the infinity of Hashem. So this one uncovers it this way, but what it ultimately gets us to is to the very essence. You may recall, we're going to see it when we start the next section of Sha'ar Yichud V'Amunah, that we use the mashal of a stencil. Meaning, if I have a black piece of paper and I have a white cutout stencil that I hold over it, so the person seeing it says, oh, I see the letter Aleph. But of course, if I take the stencil away, you see that it's really one amorphous entity. Because if I put a stencil of a base or a different letter, then that's what you see. Why? Because I have highlighted that particular characteristic. You may recall we did this visual experiment, 5 years ago. So essentially what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is a similar idea. When I do the Lulav and Esrog, I'm seeing the infinity of Hashem through one specific manifestation, just like the DNA that I can see through any part of the body. When I do another mitzvah, I'm expressing a different level of godliness. That's accessed through that characteristic. So again, each mitzvah action is expressing it, just like each body part is expressing the identity of who I truly am. Just like we know this about very close friends. There's a story in Hayom Yom, and I'm sorry for maybe confusing some of the details, but the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe, when he learned, he would use a certain melody in his studies, and that the Hasidim, and I got maybe confusing some of the details, but the core point is they would know in which area he was studying based on the inflection in his voice. And we know this. If you have a dear friend or a parent and a child or somebody with whom you are extraordinarily close, you can tell who they are by their voice, by the sound of their footsteps, by some seemingly trivial characteristic of that person is an indicator immediately to their closest friend as to who it is. I hear their footsteps, I know it's that person. How? But I can't describe it to you. Well, it becomes a similar opportunity in our relationship with Hashem. We can identify the essence of Hashem through these portals of entry of these apparently independent concepts and behaviors. Okay, Ella, it's just to continue. Kulam etzem echad, it's all one. Ruchni, spiritual, pashur mufsha, stripped down, because tzir gashmi, from any form, or any measurement, v'geder, or categorization, makam, space, mida, character, v'gvul gashmi, or any physical. And when we say physical, we don't only mean tangible; we mean even conceptual characteristic. You can't say that my identity is more my head than my feet. Because who I am is not constrictable to a place. All 613 capacities are subsumed within my very essence. And then they are expressed through the aspects of creation. And every time we access the infinity of Hashem through a mitzvah behavior, we identify that characteristic of godliness that was heretofore trapped. And then we can identify Hashem from the footsteps, from the intonation of the voice, and so on. Because the neshama has these 613 characteristics, the body has these 1613 characteristics. And as we match them up, we create the union, almost a reunion, of each of the spiritual characteristics, with each of the human characteristics, with each of the mitzvah characteristics. And in this process, we identify Hashem in every aspect of our existence. Now, we're going to come back to revisit. So then what is the difference between Yom Kippur and Tuesday and the Seder and dinner and the Beis HaMikdash and the grocery store and so on, and the brain and the rest of the body? So the first thing we have to know is you're right. Like the famous message also of the third Rebbe, Mach Eretz Yisrael, make Eretz Yisrael here. We have to make every space a holy place. We have to reveal the innate essential godliness. So what do you want Mashiach for? Why can't we just have godliness everywhere? So we're going to come back to that. But for that, we'll have to wait till next week. All right. Have a good week, everybody. And we'll see you next time.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everybody.